I don't want my children around someone who's accomplished nothing. Those words came from my sister Victoria's mouth 3 years ago, and I can still hear them as clearly as if she'd spoken them yesterday, each syllable sharp enough to draw blood. I'm Emma, 32 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the family disappointment, the sister who chose wrong, the daughter who couldn't quite measure up to the impossible standards set by Victoria, who is 3 years older and has never let me forget it. She's the golden child, always has been. Married to Derek Montgomery, who comes from old money and made even more of it in commercial real estate, living in a sprawling house in the nicest part of Seattle with their two perfect children, Sophie, who's 6 now, and Jack, who just turned 8. I'm a freelance architect, which sounds more impressive than it felt for most of these years, working from my modest apartment in Capitol Hill, taking whatever projects I could get, designing small renovations and additions for clients who appreciated my work but couldn't pay what the big firms charged. Victoria made sure I understood exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy, and that assessment came with consequences that cut deeper than any words. The first time she actually banned me from seeing my niece and nephew was 2 years ago, right after Jack's 6th birthday party, an elaborate affair at a rented event space, complete with a petting zoo and a magician that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. I'd brought a carefully chosen gift, a set of building blocks I'd found at a specialty toy store, the kind that let kids create actual architectural structures, and Jack had loved them, his face lighting up as he dumped them out on the table. But Victoria had pulled me aside an hour into the party, her smile tight and her voice low so the other parents wouldn't hear, and told me that she'd been thinking about what kind of influence I was on her children. "You're 30 years old, and you still don't have a real career," she'd said, standing there in her designer dress that probably cost more than my rent, diamond studs catching the light as she tilted her head with false sympathy. "I just think it's better if Jack and Sophie don't get too attached to someone who can't provide them with a stable example of success." I'd stood there speechless, watching her walk away, watching Jack play with the blocks I'd given him, and realizing that I was being erased from their lives because I didn't meet some arbitrary standard of achievement that Victoria had decided to enforce. The cruelest part was that our parents said nothing, did nothing, just accepted Victoria's decree as if it were reasonable, as if I were somehow toxic simply for not being wealthy. What connected us legally, ironically, was the one thing I had that Victoria couldn't control completely: our childhood home in Ballard, left to both of us in equal shares when our grandmother died 5 years ago, a modest but charming craftsman house on a double lot that had appreciated considerably in Seattle's overheated real estate market. Victoria wanted to sell it immediately, but I'd refused, not out of spite, but because it was the only piece of family history I had left, the only place where I'd felt valued before everything became about money and status and keeping up appearances. That property was about to become very important, though I didn't know it yet. Before continuing this story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern didn't start when Victoria banned me from seeing her children. It started decades before that, woven so deeply into our family dynamic that I sometimes wonder if I ever had a chance at being seen as equal. Victoria was always the golden child, always the one who did everything right, and our parents made sure we both knew it. She was 3 years older, which meant she hit every milestone first. And each one was celebrated with the kind of attention and pride that somehow never quite materialized when my turn came around. She made straight A's, became student body president, got into Stanford for undergrad, and then Harvard Law. And our parents told everyone they met about their brilliant daughter who was going to be a partner at a major firm by 30. I was good at school too, loved drawing and building things from the time I could hold a pencil. But when I told them at 17 that I wanted to study architecture instead of following Victoria into law, I watched something shift in how they looked at me. Dad actually said, "Architecture is a nice hobby, but wouldn't you rather have a stable career?" as if designing buildings wasn't a real profession. And Mom spent months trying to talk me into at least considering business school as a backup plan. I went to the University of Washington, stayed local because the scholarship was good, and because some part of me still wanted their approval, still thought I could prove that my path was just as valid as Victoria's. But every family dinner became an implicit comparison, Victoria's cases and courtroom victories dominating the conversation while my design projects got polite nods before the subject changed. The first major exclusion that really hurt was Victoria's wedding 8 years ago, this enormous affair at a waterfront venue with 200 guests, and a price tag I didn't want to imagine. I was a bridesmaid, technically, but Victoria chose 5 of her law school friends as her actual wedding party, and I was added almost as an afterthought, given a different dress from the others, and positioned at the far end in all the photos. She'd already met Derek by then, already started moving in circles where wealth was assumed and displayed casually, and I remember standing at the rehearsal dinner, listening to toasts about her brilliance and her future, while I smiled until my face hurt and tried not to feel invisible. 2 years ago, at a family dinner at our parents' house in Laurelhurst, Victoria asked me how my work was going with this tone that suggested she was asking a child about finger painting. And when I explained that I'd just finished designing a sustainable addition for a nonprofit's community center, she'd laughed and said, "That's sweet, Emma. It's nice that you're doing charity work. But when are you going to pursue actual clients who can pay you?" Mom had changed the subject quickly, but she hadn't corrected Victoria, hadn't suggested that maybe my work had value, even if it didn't come with a corporate salary. That same grandmother who left us the Ballard property had understood what I was trying to do, had always asked to see my sketches, and told me I had a gift. And when she died and left that house to both Victoria and me equally, I'd felt like it was her way of saying I mattered just as much. Victoria had immediately wanted to sell, to split the money and be done with it, but I'd refused because that house represented something I couldn't quite articulate then, some proof that at least one person in our family had believed in me. Victoria married Derek 5 years ago in a ceremony that somehow managed to be even more extravagant than their engagement party, and that wedding marked the beginning of a new era in our family dynamic, one where wealth became the measuring stick for worth, and I found myself on the wrong side of an ever-widening divide. Derek came from money, real generational wealth, and he'd multiplied it through commercial real estate investments that Victoria loved to mention casually at family gatherings. And suddenly my sister wasn't just successful, she was rich in a way that changed how she moved through the world. They bought the house in Madison Park 6 months after the wedding, this sprawling modern construction with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Lake Washington that probably cost $3 million. And I remember the housewarming party where Victoria gave tours, and I tried to feel happy for her while simultaneously feeling like I was visiting a museum of everything I'd never have. I was 27 then, just starting out as a freelance architect after working for a small firm that had laid off half its staff during a slow period, taking whatever projects I could find and learning that passion for design didn't automatically translate into financial stability. Sophie was born a year after they moved into that house, and I was there at the hospital, holding my tiny niece and feeling this overwhelming love mixed with sadness, because I could already see how different her life would be from mine, how she'd grow up with every advantage and never understand what it meant to struggle. For the first 2 years of Sophie's life, I was allowed to be an aunt, showing up for weekend visits with small gifts I'd made myself because I couldn't afford the expensive toys Victoria's other friends brought, reading stories and playing pretend while Victoria hosted her book club or got ready for another charity gala. Jack was born when Sophie was 2, and I loved him just as immediately, this serious little baby who studied everything with intense concentration. And I started imagining the kind of relationship we'd have as he grew up, the things I could teach him about building and design. But everything changed when Jack was 3 and Sophie was 5, 3 years ago now, after Victoria sat me down in her pristine living room with its white furniture that always made me nervous and told me she'd been thinking about what kind of influence I was having on her children, You're almost 30, Emma, and you still don't have a stable income, she'd said, her voice gentle in that particularly cruel way people use when they're saying something devastating but want to seem concerned. I just think it's confusing for Sophie and Jack to see you struggling when Derek and I have worked so hard to provide them with security. I tried to explain that freelancing meant variable income, but that I was building a client base, that my work was meaningful even if it didn't pay corporate salaries. But Victoria had already made up her mind. I think it's better if we limit their exposure to unstable situations, she'd said, and I'd understood that unstable situations meant me, that I'd been reclassified from beloved aunt to potential bad influence. She'd justified it as protecting her children from seeing failure as acceptable, from thinking that financial instability was a viable life path, and our parents had nodded along when she'd explained her reasoning at the next family dinner, Mom saying something about how Victoria had to make decisions she thought were best for her family. The systematic exclusion started immediately, birthday invitations that came with the understanding that I could drop off a gift but shouldn't stay. Holidays where I was invited to the adult dinner after the children were already in bed. A careful architecture of absence that kept me at arm's length from the two people I'd loved without condition. The 3 years after Victoria instituted the exclusion policy became a catalog of missed moments that accumulated like small cuts, each one not quite devastating on its own, but together forming a pattern of systematic erasure from my niece and nephew's lives. I missed Sophie's first day of kindergarten, her dance recital where she played a butterfly, Jack's preschool graduation where he reportedly sang louder than anyone else, countless Halloween costumes I only saw in photos Victoria posted on Facebook that I studied like artifacts from a life happening parallel to mine, but forever out of reach. Christmas 2 years ago stands out with particular clarity, how Victoria had invited me to their house on December 26th instead of Christmas Day itself, explaining that she wanted the actual holiday to be just their immediate family, and when I'd arrived with carefully wrapped presents I'd spent hours selecting. Handmade wooden blocks for Jack that I'd carved and painted myself, and a dollhouse I'd designed and built for Sophie with tiny furniture I'd crafted from balsa wood. Victoria had accepted them with a tight smile and said, "You really don't have to make things, Emma. We have plenty of toys. Maybe just gift cards next time would be easier." The presents I'd received from them were clearly last-minute additions. A generic candle set that smelled like artificial vanilla, and a coffee shop gift card for $15. And the disproportion wasn't about the money, but about the thought, the care, the message that I wasn't worth consideration. My professional life during those years felt like running on a treadmill set at an incline I couldn't quite manage, taking on projects that paid barely enough to cover my rent on the Fremont apartment that Victoria had once described as charmingly bohemian, in a tone that made clear she meant small and shabby. I'd designed a renovation for a family-owned bookstore in Ballard, created plans for a community garden greenhouse in Columbia City, worked on a residential addition for a young couple in Wallingford who had a limited budget and unlimited enthusiasm, and each project taught me something and added to my portfolio. But none of them impressed my family when they bothered to ask about my work at the quarterly dinners Mom insisted we still attend. Victoria would sit at those dinners in clothes that cost more than I made in a month, talking about Derek's latest investment property or the private school they were considering for Sophie. And when the conversation turned to me, I felt the temperature drop as everyone scrambled for something polite to say about my situation, treating my career like a chronic illness we all had to pretend might improve someday. "How's the freelancing going?" Uncle Robert had asked at one dinner 18 months ago, and I'd started explaining a project I was excited about, a sustainable tiny home design that might be featured in a local architecture blog, when Victoria had interrupted with, "Emma's very committed to her lifestyle choices. Even if they're not particularly practical, we all have to admire her dedication to struggling on principle." The comment had landed like a slap, but everyone had laughed uncomfortably and moved on, and I'd sat there pushing food around my plate and wondering when I'd become the family charity case. The cautionary tale, the one they loved in theory but found embarrassing in practice. I kept showing up to these gatherings because some stubborn part of me refused to be driven away, refused to make it easy for them to write me off completely, but each one cost me something. Each one reinforced that I existed at the margins of this family and always would, unless something fundamental changed. 6 months ago, on a rainy Saturday in March, Mom turned 60 years old, and Victoria insisted on hosting a celebration dinner at the Lake House, this upscale restaurant on the south end of Lake Union, where the prix-fixe menu cost $90 per person, and the wine list required a sommelier to navigate. And I'd spent 2 weeks saving up from the payment I'd received for designing a residential deck addition, just so I could afford to attend and contribute to the gift Victoria had organized, without asking if the $300 contribution she'd suggested was feasible for everyone. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, nothing fancy, but presentable. This deep blue sheath from Nordstrom Rack that had been on clearance for $42. And I'd arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early because I was nervous and wanted to settle myself before facing the whole family. But when I walked into the private dining room Victoria had reserved, she was already there with Derek and the kids. Supervising the placement of elaborate floral arrangements she'd clearly brought herself, and directing the staff on the setup of a gift table that already held several large boxes wrapped in expensive-looking paper. Victoria was wearing what I recognized as a designer dress, probably Diane von Furstenberg or something similar, with jewelry that caught the light every time she moved. And Sophie and Jack were dressed like they were attending a wedding. Sophie in a velvet dress with patent leather shoes, and Jack in a tiny suit with a clip-on tie. And I felt immediately underdressed and outspent before the evening had even begun. "Oh, Emma, you made it," Victoria had said when she noticed me, her tone suggesting mild surprise that I'd managed to show up. And I'd smiled and said hello to the kids who looked at me with the polite confusion of children who vaguely recognize someone but can't quite place them from where. And Jack had started to come toward me before Victoria placed a hand on his shoulder and steered him toward the table where she wanted the children to sit, at the far end, away from where she'd already placed name cards for the adults. I'd brought a gift for Mom that I'd wrapped myself, a framed architectural drawing I'd done of our childhood home before Dad died, and we'd sold it, working from old photographs and my own memories, to recreate the house in precise detail with watercolor accents, something that had taken me hours but cost almost nothing except materials. And I'd placed it on the gift table next to Victoria's enormous boxes and immediately felt the inadequacy of it, how small and homemade it looked next to her obvious expense. The rest of the family arrived gradually over the next 20 minutes. Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda, a few of Mom's friends from her book club, some cousins I barely knew, and Mom herself arriving last in the outfit Victoria had clearly helped her select, looking happier than I'd seen her since Dad died 4 years ago. And I'd felt this complicated mix of love for her and resentment that Victoria got to orchestrate this moment while I stood at the margins trying to figure out where I was supposed to be. Victoria had controlled the seating with the same precision she applied to everything in her life, placing Mom at the head of the table with herself and Derek on either side, arranging the other guests in what seemed like order of importance, and I'd found my name card near the far end of the table, next to Cousin James, who I'd met maybe 3 times in my entire life, and who spent the cocktail hour talking to the person on his other side. And across from me sat Sophie and Jack, with Victoria's friend Michelle, who was apparently responsible for keeping the children entertained so the adults could enjoy their dinner. I'd watched Jack from across the table, studying how much he'd grown, how much I'd missed in the 2 months since I'd last seen him briefly at a family gathering. And I'd felt this ache in my chest that was becoming familiar. This grief for a relationship that should have been mine, but had been taken away by someone who'd decided I wasn't good enough to be part of her children's lives. Dinner had progressed through the appetizer course and into the main meal when Jack, who must have been bored sitting at the children's end of the table with only Sophie and Victoria's friend Michelle for company, slipped away from his seat and wandered down to where I sat picking at my salmon, and he'd stopped next to my chair with this curious expression on his face and asked in that clear, innocent voice that children have before they learn to whisper, "Aunt Emma, How come you never come visit us anymore? Mommy says you're always too busy, but Sophie says you just don't like us. The question hit me like a physical blow. This child I loved asking why I'd abandoned him when the truth was so much more complicated and painful, and I'd opened my mouth to answer, to find some way to explain that wouldn't hurt him or make Victoria look bad, when Victoria herself appeared at Jack's side with a speed that suggested she'd been watching him, her hand clamping down on his shoulder hard enough that I saw him wince. Jack, we talked about this. Aunt Emma has her own life, and we have ours. Now come back to your seat and finish your dinner, Victoria had said with this bright, brittle tone that was clearly meant to end the conversation. But Jack had persisted with the brutal honesty of an 8-year-old, saying, "But you said she doesn't have time for us because she's not successful like you and Daddy." And I'd watched Victoria's face flush as she physically steered Jack back toward his end of the table, leaving me sitting there with everyone in the immediate vicinity having heard the exchange, the conversation around us dying into uncomfortable silence. Uncle Robert, possibly trying to ease the awkwardness, or possibly just oblivious to the tension, had turned to me and asked, "So, Emma, Victoria mentioned you're still doing the architecture thing. How's that working out for you?" And I'd been grateful for the subject change, had started explaining the project I was currently working on, a renovation of a historic building in the university district that was being converted into a community arts space, describing the challenges of preserving the original character while modernizing the infrastructure. And I'd felt myself relaxing slightly as I talked about something I actually cared about, something I was good at, when Victoria's voice had cut across mine with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Oh, Emma's still doing her freelance work, calling herself an architect, even though she never worked for an actual firm. It's basically glorified sketching for people who can't afford real architectural services," Victoria had said, her voice carrying across the entire dining room. And I'd stopped mid-sentence and looked at her, really looked at her, and seen something in her face that was worse than anger or dismissal. Something that looked almost like satisfaction at putting me in my place. I mean, we all admire Emma's persistence, don't we? Continuing to pursue this little passion project, even though it's been, 6 years now, and she still can't even afford a real apartment. Still living in that tiny place in Fremont that doesn't even have a proper bedroom, working for clients who probably pay her in gift cards and good intentions, Victoria had continued. And the entire table had gone silent now, even the waitstaff hovering at the periphery, seeming to sense that something ugly was unfolding, and I'd sat there feeling every eye in the room on me, feeling the weight of my family's pity and embarrassment, feeling something inside me that had been bending for years finally approach its breaking point. I don't want my children around someone who's accomplished nothing, who has nothing to show for her life except a portfolio of projects nobody's ever heard of and a stubborn refusal to accept that maybe she chose the wrong path, Victoria had said, her voice quieter now but somehow more devastating for its matter-of-fact tone, as if she were simply stating an obvious truth that everyone else was too polite to mention. And I'd felt my hands trembling in my lap, felt my throat closing around all the words I wanted to say, all the defenses I wanted to mount, and instead, I just sat there in my $42 clearance dress and let her words land like blows I no longer had the energy to block. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, feeling my face burn with humiliation and my eyes start to sting with tears I absolutely refused to let fall in front of everyone. And I could feel the weight of all those pitying stares from the cousins and the book club friends, and Uncle Robert, who'd only been trying to make conversation, and what made it worse was that nobody said anything, nobody jumped to my defense, or told Victoria she'd gone too far. They all just sat there in this awful, uncomfortable silence, like they were waiting for me to either break down or disappear so they could go back to celebrating Mom's birthday without this unpleasant scene disrupting the expensive meal. Mom herself looked down at her plate. Her face flushed with what might have been embarrassment, but certainly wasn't anger on my behalf. And I watched her take a sip of wine and then turn to Aunt Linda and ask about her recent vacation to Hawaii, deliberately changing the subject as if Victoria hadn't just eviscerated me in front of the entire family, as if the appropriate response to watching one daughter publicly humiliate the other was to simply pretend it hadn't happened and move on to more pleasant topics. Dinner continued around me in this awkward, stilted way, conversations restarting in fits and starts, voices a little too loud and laughter a little too forced, and I sat there pushing salmon around my plate and trying to disappear into my chair while also trying to maintain some shred of dignity. And I realized with this horrible clarity that this was never going to change, that I could spend the rest of my life trying to prove myself to Victoria and my parents, and it would never be enough because they'd already decided who I was in their narrative, and nothing I did would revise that story. I stayed through dessert because leaving early would have felt like admitting defeat, would have given Victoria the satisfaction of knowing she'd driven me away. So I endured the birthday cake and the opening of presents, and watched Mom exclaim over Victoria's expensive gifts, a weekend spa package and a cashmere wrap that probably cost more than my rent. And when she got to my framed drawing, she'd smiled and said it was lovely and set it aside quickly, and I'd known in that moment that it would end up in a closet somewhere, too personal and homemade to display when Victoria's gifts were so much more impressive. I left as soon as it was socially acceptable, hugging Mom and wishing her happy birthday again, and Victoria had given me this cool smile and said, "Thanks for coming, Emma. I know it's hard for you to afford these kinds of things," as if she were being gracious instead of twisting the knife one more time, and I'd walked out of the lake house into the March rain without an umbrella and sat in my 12-year-old Honda Civic in the parking lot and finally let myself cry, really cry, ugly sobbing that made my whole body shake and left my face blotchy and my eyes swollen. I drove home to my studio apartment in Fremont, the one Victoria had mocked for not having a proper bedroom, and I'd sat on my bed and looked around at my life, at the drafting table by the window and the portfolio cases leaning against the wall and the model buildings I'd constructed for various projects, and I'd felt this crushing doubt about whether Victoria was right, whether I'd wasted 6 years chasing something I was never going to achieve, whether I should have just gone to law school like everyone expected and saved myself this humiliation. I'd pulled out my portfolio and gone through it project by project, looking at the work I'd done, the residential additions and the small commercial spaces, and the historic renovation I'd been describing when Victoria cut me off. And I'd tried to see them through my family's eyes, tried to understand why what felt significant to me looked like failure to them. And somewhere in that process, I'd felt something shift inside me, some fundamental understanding that I'd been seeking validation from people who were never going to give it. And that maybe the problem wasn't my work or my choices, but the fact that I kept returning to this well, expecting to find water when it had been dry for years. What I hadn't told anyone at that disastrous birthday dinner, what I'd been keeping to myself for 3 months before Victoria humiliated me in front of the entire family, was that in December, I'd won a competition. I'd entered almost on a whim, a design competition for a new cultural center in Portland that was being funded by a consortium of arts organizations and the city itself, and I'd submitted my proposal not really expecting anything, because there were firms from all over the Pacific Northwest, competing, real established firms with names everyone recognized. And then I'd gotten the call 2 days before Christmas from the selection committee telling me that my design had been chosen. I remembered sitting in my studio apartment with my phone pressed to my ear, while the committee chair, a woman named Patricia Chen, who ran the Portland Arts Council, explained that my proposal had won unanimously, that the committee had been impressed by how I'd integrated community space with performance venues, how I'd designed the building to feel welcoming rather than intimidating, how I'd managed to stay within their budget while still creating something architecturally significant. And she'd said the words, $2 million project, and I'd had to sit down because my legs had literally gone weak. The contract had been signed on January 8th, just 6 weeks before Mom's birthday dinner. And I'd received the first payment of $180,000, which was more money than I'd made in the previous 3 years combined. And I'd sat in the law office where we'd done the signing and stared at the check and felt this surreal mixture of vindication and disbelief. And my first instinct had been to call my parents, to call Victoria, to share this news with my family because isn't that what you're supposed to do when something wonderful happens? But I'd been sitting in my car in that law office parking lot with my phone in my hand, and I'd remembered every dismissive comment, every time Victoria had called my work a hobby, every time my parents had suggested maybe I should think about a more stable career. And I'd realized that I was tired, so profoundly tired of seeking their approval, of trying to prove myself to people who had already decided I was the family disappointment, and I'd put my phone away and made a conscious choice to keep this to myself, to let this success be mine without contaminating it with their belated pride or Victoria's inevitable way of diminishing it. The work had intensified after the contract signing, consuming my days and many of my nights as I developed the detailed plans, coordinated with engineers and contractors, attended planning commission meetings, and the project had started gaining attention in professional circles. Architecture blogs writing about the design, industry publications reaching out for interviews, and I'd felt myself growing into this new identity as someone whose work mattered, whose vision was respected. And with each passing week, the opinion of my family had mattered less because I was building something real, something that would stand in the world with my name on it, and that felt like validation enough. I'd moved out of the studio apartment in February into a one-bedroom with actual separate rooms, and I hadn't told my family about that either, and I'd opened a savings account and watched the balance grow and felt this quiet sense of security I'd never experienced before. And by the time Mom's birthday dinner rolled around in March, I'd been living in this parallel reality where I was successful and respected and financially stable, while my family still saw me as struggling, unsuccessful Emma who couldn't even afford a proper apartment. And I'd gone to that dinner knowing the truth about my situation, but not feeling any need to correct their assumptions. Not until Jack's innocent question and Victoria's cruel response had shown me exactly how my family saw me, and always would, unless something fundamental changed. The 3 months after Mom's birthday dinner marked a fundamental shift in how I engaged with my family. A deliberate stepping back that felt both necessary for my sanity and surprisingly liberating once I allowed myself to actually do it. I stopped initiating contact, stopped calling Mom every Sunday like I'd done for years, stopped sending the chatty texts to the family group chat that Victoria usually ignored anyway, and instead I threw myself completely into the Cultural Center project, spending 12 and 14-hour days refining designs and meeting with contractors and presenting progress reports to the Arts Council. And the work was demanding, but also deeply satisfying, in a way that family dinners had never been, because here my contributions were valued, my vision respected, my expertise trusted rather than dismissed. In late April, the project started getting real attention beyond local architecture circles when Portland Monthly ran a feature on upcoming developments in the city's cultural landscape and devoted 2 full pages to the center, including renderings of my design and a photograph of me at the construction site wearing a hard hat and holding blueprints, looking far more professional and accomplished than the struggling failure Victoria had described at that dinner. Then in May, Architectural Digest published their annual Emerging Designers to Watch issue, and I was one of 12 architects featured nationally, with a full spread showing the cultural center design alongside 2 of my previous projects, a historic renovation in Ballard and a modern residential addition in Queen Anne, and the article described my work as thoughtfully bridging contemporary needs with contextual sensitivity. And I'd read that line probably 20 times, letting myself feel proud of it, letting it matter more than any compliment my family had never given me. I didn't send the article to my parents, didn't post about it on social media where they might see it, just let it exist in the professional world where I was building a reputation completely separate from their awareness or approval. In early June, an envelope arrived at my apartment, thick cream cardstock with Victoria's calligraphy addressing, and inside was an invitation to Sophie's 7th birthday party, a princess-themed celebration at their house in Laurelhurst, with a date 3 weeks away, and I'd held that invitation for a long time, remembering all the parties I'd been excluded from over the years. All the milestone moments with my niece and nephew that I'd missed because Victoria had decided I wasn't good enough to be part of their lives. I RSVP'd no, sent a children's book as a gift with a card signed simply Aunt Emma, and felt no guilt about the decision because Victoria had made it clear that I was only welcome in her children's lives when it was convenient for her, when my presence didn't threaten whatever narrative she'd constructed about her perfect family. Mom called 2 days after she must have heard about my declined invitation, her voice carrying that particular tone of confused disappointment that suggested she genuinely didn't understand why I might not want to attend. Victoria said you're not coming to Sophie's party, she'd said, and I'd responded that I had work commitments, which was true. I did have a planning commission meeting that week, though not on the actual day of the party. She'll be so disappointed, Emma. She was really hoping you'd be there, Mom had continued. And I'd thought about how Sophie probably didn't even remember me well enough to be disappointed. How Victoria had carefully edited me out of her children's lives, to the point where I was barely more than a name to them. I'll make it up to her another time, I'd said, knowing there wouldn't be another time. Not unless something fundamental changed, and Mom had sighed and said she hoped I wasn't letting work consume me too much. That family was important, and I'd gotten off the phone feeling that familiar mixture of frustration and resignation, because even now, even after everything, they couldn't see the contradiction in calling family important, while never once defending me or acknowledging how Victoria had treated me. What I didn't know during those months when I was deliberately distancing myself from my family, when I was building my new life around professional success and personal boundaries, was that Victoria's perfect world was beginning to crack in ways that she was desperately trying to hide from everyone, including our parents, who still saw her as the golden child who'd made all the right choices. Derek's commercial real estate development company, which had seemed so successful and impressive when Victoria had married him 6 years ago, had been increasingly struggling since late the previous year when interest rates had risen and several of his major projects had failed to secure the financing he'd been counting on. And by the time I'd declined Sophie's birthday invitation in June, Derek was already in serious conversations with creditors and lawyers about restructuring debt that had grown to nearly $3 million. Victoria had known about the problems since March, right around the time of Mom's birthday dinner actually, which explained nothing about her cruelty that night, but perhaps added context to the stress she'd been carrying, and she'd initially believed Derek when he said it was temporary. Just a cash flow issue that would resolve itself once a few deals closed, but those deals kept falling through and the situation kept deteriorating, and by July they'd missed 2 mortgage payments on the Laurelhurst house with its $8,500 monthly payment, and the bank had sent the first notice of default. They'd been living on credit cards for months, maintaining the appearance of their expensive lifestyle, even as the foundation crumbled beneath them, and Victoria had continued posting carefully curated photos on social media of family outings and her designer handbags and the kids in their private school uniforms. Because admitting struggle would have meant admitting failure, and that was something Victoria had never learned how to do. The conversation about selling assets had started in early August, when Derek had finally admitted to Victoria that bankruptcy was a real possibility, unless they could liquidate some of their holdings. And they'd gone through everything they owned: the vacation property in Bend that was underwater on its mortgage, Derek's boat that wouldn't sell for anywhere near what they owed on it, Victoria's jewelry that was worth less than she'd believed, and then Derek had mentioned the property in Ballard, the house where Victoria and I had grown up, which our parents had left to both of us when they'd downsized to a condo 4 years ago. The house had been rented out since then to a family paying $200 a month, which had been split between Victoria and me, and I'd been grateful for that extra $1,600 monthly, even when my finances had been tight. And Victoria had barely noticed it because what was $1,600 to someone whose household income had been over $400,000 a year, at least before everything had started falling apart. The property was worth somewhere around $850,000 based on comparable sales in the neighborhood, which meant Victoria's half represented over $400,000 in equity they could access. and Derek had pointed out that this was potentially the asset that could save them from foreclosure, from bankruptcy, from having to admit to everyone that their perfect life had been a facade. Victoria had resisted initially because selling the house meant needing my cooperation, meant having to contact me after months of the cold distance I'd established, meant having to ask me for something when she'd spent years making it clear that I had nothing she wanted or needed. But by mid-August, the desperation had outweighed the pride, and she'd started planning how to approach me, how to frame the request in a way that didn't reveal just how badly she needed this to work. Victoria's call came on a Thursday evening in late August, her name appearing on my phone screen for the first time in nearly 2 months, and I'd stared at it for 3 rings before answering, genuinely surprised because we'd had virtually no contact since I'd declined Sophie's birthday party, and the silence had felt mutual, almost comfortable in its clarity. "Emma, hi," she'd said when I answered, her voice carrying a brightness that sounded forced, artificially cheerful in a way that immediately put me on guard because Victoria's cruelty I knew how to navigate, but this false warmth was unfamiliar territory. "I know it's been a while. I've been meaning to call. Things have just been so busy with the kids' summer activities and everything, but I was thinking maybe we could meet for coffee sometime soon, catch up properly, just the two of us." I'd felt suspicion settle in my chest because Victoria had never, not once in our adult lives, suggested we meet for coffee to catch up, had never shown any interest in my life beyond what was necessary at family gatherings, and this sudden desire for sister time made no sense unless she wanted something. "Coffee?" I'd repeated, keeping my voice neutral, and she'd continued in that same unnaturally bright tone. "Yes, maybe this weekend? Saturday morning? There's that new place in Fremont, supposed to have amazing pastries, my treat." The offer to pay, the specific suggestion of location and time, the general eagerness, all of it screamed ulterior motive, but I'd agreed anyway because I was curious now, because after months of being ignored and dismissed, I wanted to know what could possibly make Victoria reach out to me with this transparent attempt at warmth. We'd met that Saturday at the cafe she'd suggested, a trendy spot with exposed brick and reclaimed wood tables, and Victoria was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a latte in front of her, and I'd noticed immediately that something was off about her, a tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that her makeup didn't quite conceal, and her designer bag sat on the chair next to her. But it wasn't new. I recognized it from at least 2 years ago, which was unusual because Victoria typically rotated through new luxury purchases like they were seasonal decorations. "Thanks for meeting me," she'd said as I sat down, and I'd ordered a plain coffee from the server and waited because I wasn't going to make this easy by filling the silence with small talk. Wasn't going to pretend this was a normal sisterly coffee date when we both knew it wasn't. She'd asked about my work in that vague way people do when they're not really interested, but need to observe social niceties, and I'd given equally vague answers, watching her fidget with her cup, watching her work up to whatever she'd actually called me here to discuss. Finally, after about 15 minutes of painful pseudo-conversation, she'd shifted in her seat and said, "So, I wanted to talk to you about the Ballard property, the house." And there it was, the real reason. And I'd felt something click into place because of course this was about the house. About the one thing that still connected us legally and financially. "What about it?" I'd asked. And Victoria had launched into an explanation about how she and Derek had been reviewing their investment portfolio, about how they thought it made sense to liquidate some assets and reinvest in other opportunities, about how the rental property was good, but they could do better with that capital elsewhere. And it was all delivered in this rehearsed way that made it clear she'd practiced this conversation. "We'd like to sell it," she'd finally said directly, "and we're prepared to buy out your half if you'd prefer. We could offer you $300,000, which is more than fair for your share." I'd set my coffee cup down carefully before responding, taking a moment to process the number she'd just thrown out. Because $300,000 for half of a property worth $850,000 meant she was trying to buy my share for roughly 70% of its actual value. And the lowball offer told me more about her situation than any of her rehearsed explanations about investment opportunities had. Why now? I'd asked, watching her face, and she'd blinked as if the question surprised her, as if the timing should be obvious. I told you, we're restructuring our portfolio. Derek's financial advisor suggested this would be a smart move, and the explanation sounded even more hollow the second time, and I'd leaned forward slightly, holding her gaze. Victoria, what's really going on? You've never cared about that property before. You barely noticed the rental income. And now suddenly it's urgent enough that you're reaching out after months of not speaking to me? I'd seen something flicker across her face, a crack in the facade, but she'd recovered quickly, her voice taking on a slight edge as she said, "It's not urgent. It's just good planning, being proactive about our finances. But yes, we'd like to move forward relatively soon, within the next month ideally." The timeline she was trying to downplay actually revealed the pressure she was under, and I'd nodded slowly, letting silence stretch between us, because I'd learned that silence made people uncomfortable enough to reveal more than they intended. "I'll need to think about it," I'd finally said, and I'd watched Victoria's jaw tighten, watched her struggle to maintain the pleasant mask. "What's there to think about? It's a fair offer, Emma. More than fair, actually. And it's not like you have the capital to buy me out instead." And there was the condescension I knew so well. The assumption that of course I couldn't afford anything, that I should be grateful she was offering me anything at all. "I'll need to consider my options," I'd repeated calmly. And Victoria had set her cup down harder than necessary, her frustration breaking through. "We really need an answer soon, Emma. There are time-sensitive aspects to this. Opportunities that won't wait indefinitely." And the desperation was showing now, the careful pretense crumbling. I decided to push, curious how far the facade would crack. "If I agree to this, if I sign whatever papers are needed, would that mean I could see Sophie and Jack more? Maybe be part of their lives again?" I'd asked the question genuinely wanting to know if anything had changed, if her sudden need for my cooperation might translate into a thaw in the cold exclusion she'd maintained for years. But Victoria's expression had shifted to something between surprise and irritation. "That's a separate issue, Emma. This is about property and finances, and my concerns about the kids being around certain influences haven't changed just because we're having a business discussion." And there it was, the confirmation that nothing had actually changed, that she saw this as purely transactional, that even in needing something from me she still considered me unworthy of my own niece and nephew. I'd felt something harden in my chest then, a clarity settling over me. This was purely about what I could do for her, with no recognition of years of hurt, no acknowledgement that maybe she'd been wrong about me, no evolution in how she saw me at all. "I need to go," I'd said, standing up, and Victoria had looked almost panicked. "Wait, can we at least agree on a timeline for your decision? Derek really needs to know by next week." And I'd shouldered my bag, looking down at her. "I'll let you know when I've decided." And I'd walked out of that cafe, leaving her sitting there with her cooling latte, and her barely concealed desperation. And I'd known from the tension in her shoulders and the edge in her voice that whatever was really happening in her life, it was far worse than investment opportunities and portfolio restructuring. I'd spent that Sunday afternoon doing what I should have done years ago when we'd first inherited the property, pulling up recent comparable sales in the Ballard neighborhood and running actual numbers on what our rental house was worth. And within an hour, I'd confirmed what I'd suspected in that cafe, that Victoria's $300,000 offer for my half was roughly $125,000 below fair market value, that the property we'd inherited had appreciated significantly and was now worth approximately $850,000, meaning my half was worth $425,000 at minimum. The lowball offer had been insulting enough, but what I discovered next through a former classmate who worked in commercial real estate made everything click into sharp focus. Because when I'd casually mentioned Derek's company over drinks Monday evening, asking if she'd heard anything about Henderson Development, her expression had shifted to something between surprise and pity. You haven't heard? They're in serious trouble, Emma. Overextended on that Bellevue project and the financing fell through. Word is they're looking at major losses, possibly bankruptcy. And she'd gone on to explain that Derek had leveraged everything on a mixed-use development that had hit regulatory problems and cost overruns, that the company was bleeding money, and creditors were circling. I'd sat there absorbing this information, understanding suddenly why Victoria needed to sell now, why the timeline was so urgent, why she'd swallowed her pride enough to call me after months of silence. Because they weren't restructuring for investment opportunities. They were desperately trying to stay afloat, probably facing foreclosure on that ridiculous mansion in Medina with its water views and its $40,000 property taxes. That night, I'd lain awake wrestling with what to do with this knowledge, because part of me, the part that still remembered being the little sister who'd looked up to Victoria before everything became complicated, wanted to just sign the papers and help her, wanted to be the bigger person and let the property go for whatever she could afford. But another part of me, the part that had spent years being excluded from Sophie and Jack's lives, the part that still carried the humiliation of that birthday dinner, the part that had been called a failure and a bad influence and told I'd accomplished nothing, that part wanted something different. I'd gotten up around 2 in the morning and pulled out a folder I kept in my desk drawer, a folder I'd started maintaining almost unconsciously over the years. And I'd flipped through birthday party invitations I'd been excluded from, through Christmas cards that featured Victoria's perfect family with no mention of me, through printed emails where she'd made excuses for why I couldn't attend school events or family gatherings, and I'd realized I'd been documenting my own erasure, keeping evidence of systematic exclusion even though I hadn't consciously known why. The next morning I'd made my decision, and it wasn't about revenge exactly, though I'd be lying if I said vindication didn't factor into it, but it was more about finally, after 32 years of being the accommodating one, the understanding one, the one who absorbed hurt and made excuses for others' cruelty, deciding that I deserved to be treated with basic respect and dignity. I would help Victoria, would agree to sell the property, but it would be on my terms, with my conditions, and this time, my voice would be heard because for once I held the cards and she needed something from me. And maybe that made me petty or vindictive, but I was tired of being diminished, tired of making myself smaller to make others comfortable, tired of accepting crumbs of affection from people who should have loved me unconditionally. I'd called Victoria on Thursday morning, 3 days after our coffee meeting, and I'd kept my voice steady as I'd said I was ready to discuss the property, but I wanted to do it at Mom and Dad's house this Sunday during dinner, and I'd heard the relief in her voice when she'd said, "Oh, thank God, yes, that works perfectly. We can bring the paperwork." And I'd let her assume what she wanted to assume about my readiness to cooperate. Sunday arrived with that crisp November clarity that makes Seattle almost painfully beautiful, and I dressed carefully in dark jeans and a blazer, professional but not trying too hard, and I'd driven to my parents' house in Magnolia carrying a folder that Victoria wouldn't be expecting. I'd arrived exactly on time at 5 o'clock to find everyone already there, Mom setting the table, Dad opening wine, Victoria and Derek in the living room, looking more relaxed than they had in weeks, because clearly Victoria had told them this was just a formality, just Emma finally being reasonable and signing away her half of the property so they could solve their problems. Victoria had actually smiled at me when I walked in. A genuine smile that might have been relief or might have been triumph, and she'd said, "Emma, thank you so much for being flexible about this. Derek brought all the papers. We can go over everything after dinner." And I'd nodded and set my folder on the side table and accepted a glass of wine from Dad. Dinner had been Mom's pot roast, comfort food that should have felt warm and familial, and the conversation had flowed easily with Victoria and Derek talking about the kids, about Sophie's piano recital next month, and Jack's soccer team, and I'd noticed they didn't invite me to the recital. noticed that even in their gratitude for what they assumed I was about to do, they still didn't see me as someone who belonged in those children's lives. We'd moved to the living room after clearing dishes, and Victoria had pulled out a manila envelope, and Derek had spread papers across the coffee table, and Victoria had started explaining the terms in that brisk, efficient voice she used when she was being the lawyer, pointing out where I needed to sign, and I'd let her talk for a full minute before I'd said quietly, "I have conditions." The room had gone still, and Victoria had looked up from the papers with a confused smile, as if she'd misheard, and she'd said, "What do you mean, conditions?" "Emma, we've already discussed the terms. The offer is fair." And I'd shaken my head and pulled out my own folder. "First condition," I'd said, and my voice had stayed calm and level. "Fair market value for my half of the property, which based on recent comparable sales in Ballard is $425,000, not the $300,000 you offered." Victoria's face had shifted through several expressions, confusion to disbelief to irritation, and she'd said, "That's ridiculous, Emma. You can't just make up numbers. The property isn't worth anywhere near that." But Derek had put his hand on her arm, had said quietly, "Victoria." And I'd seen in his face that he knew exactly what the property was worth, that he'd known all along they were lowballing me, and had probably counted on my ignorance or my desperation to please. I'd pulled out printed spreadsheets from my folder, 3 pages of comparable sales data that I'd prepared specifically for this moment, and I'd slid them across the coffee table to where Victoria could see the addresses, the sale prices, the price per square foot calculations, and I'd said in that same calm voice, "The property at 2847 Northwest 62nd sold for $892,000 in August. Similar square footage, slightly smaller lot, the one at 3015 Northwest 58th, went for $875,000 in June, and there are 4 more sales within a 3-block radius all in the same range. So $850,000 is actually conservative for our property given the corner lot and the recent updates to the kitchen." Mom had leaned forward to look at the papers, and I'd seen surprise register on her face. Surprise that I'd done this research, surprise that I was presenting it so professionally, and Dad had said, "Emma, I had no idea you'd looked into this so carefully." And there was something in his voice that might have been pride, or might have been discomfort, at realizing his younger daughter wasn't quite as naive as they'd all assumed. Victoria had glanced at the papers and then pushed them back toward me with barely concealed irritation, and she'd said, "This is absurd. You're cherry-picking the highest sales. You can't expect us to pay that much. We're family, Emma. You're supposed to be helping us, not treating this like some kind of business negotiation." And I'd noticed how quickly she'd shifted to making me feel guilty, to framing my reasonable request as somehow mercenary or disloyal. Derek had been studying the spreadsheets, though, and he'd said quietly, "These comps are accurate, Victoria. I've seen similar numbers." And she'd turned to him with a look that could have frozen water. But he'd held her gaze, and there was something in that exchange that told me this wasn't the first time he'd realized his wife's version of reality didn't quite match the facts. "My second condition," I'd continued, not letting the moment slip away, "is an apology. A real one. For years of excluding me from Sophie and Jack's lives, for treating me like I was somehow damaging or unworthy to be around your children, for the things you said at Mom's birthday dinner 6 months ago, and for making me feel invisible in my own family." The room had gone completely silent, that heavy silence where everyone stops breathing for a moment, and Victoria had stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. And then she'd laughed, actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, and she'd said, "You cannot be serious, Emma. I have nothing to apologize for. I made parenting decisions that I felt were best for my children, and if your feelings were hurt, then maybe you should have worked harder to be someone I felt comfortable having around them." I'd expected this response, had prepared myself for it, but hearing it spoken out loud in front of our parents still landed like a physical blow, and I'd seen Mom wince and Dad's jaw tighten, and I'd opened my folder again and pulled out the second document I'd prepared, a chronological list that I'd titled simply, Timeline of Exclusion, and I'd begun reading from it in a steady voice that somehow stayed level even though my hands wanted to shake. Jack's 8th birthday party, April 14th, 2019. I'd begun reading from my timeline, my voice steady and clear in the silent living room. I was told the party was family only, no extended relatives, but I saw the photos on Facebook later that evening showing 12 adults including Aunt Marie and Uncle Robert and Derek's entire family. Victoria had opened her mouth to speak, but I'd continued without pausing. Moving down the list, I'd spent 3 days compiling from old texts and emails and calendar entries and painful memories. Sophie's kindergarten graduation, June 8th, 2019. I asked if I could attend, and you said it was too small a venue and they were limiting guests. But Mom later mentioned there were over 40 people there. I'd looked up at Mom then and seen her face go pale as she remembered, as she realized I'd been keeping track, that all these small cuts had been recorded and remembered. Thanksgiving 2019, you hosted and told me you were keeping it to immediate family only, just you and Derek and the kids and Mom and Dad. But Derek's parents were there, his brother's whole family was there. You just decided I didn't count as immediate family. Victoria had leaned forward, her lawyer instincts kicking in, and she'd said, "Emma, this is ridiculous. Those were different situations. You're taking things out of context." But her voice had carried an edge of panic now, because she could see where this was going, could see that I'd documented everything. Christmas 2019, I'd continued. I wasn't invited to your house at all. I spent Christmas morning alone in my apartment and came to Mom and Dad's for dinner, where I got a $25 gift card to Target, while you gave Mom and Dad a weekend trip to Victoria. I'd watched Dad shift uncomfortably in his chair, watched him realize he'd been complicit in this pattern by accepting it, by never questioning why his younger daughter was always somehow separate from the family center where Victoria reigned. Jack's 9th birthday, April 2020, virtual party because of COVID. I wasn't sent the Zoom link, and when I asked about it, you said you'd forgotten, but I know you didn't forget to include Derek's college roommate who lives in Boston. My voice had stayed level as I'd moved through 2020 and into 2021, each entry a small knife wound that separately might have seemed insignificant, but together painted a portrait of systematic exclusion, of a sister who'd been methodically erased from her niece and nephew's lives. Sophie's first piano recital, November 2021. I only found out about it when Jack mentioned it at Mom's Christmas party 3 weeks later. Victoria had stood up abruptly, her face flushed, and she'd said, "Stop it, Emma, just stop. You have no idea what it's like to be a parent, to make decisions about who you want influencing your children. You were unstable. You were struggling. I had every right to protect Sophie and Jack from that instability." And I'd heard Derek make a small sound, almost a protest, because even he could hear how hollow that justification sounded when confronted with years of documented exclusion. I'd looked directly at Victoria then, still seated, still calm, and I'd pulled out one more piece of paper and I'd said, "Mother's 60th birthday dinner, May 6th, 6 months ago, at Anthony's home port. You said to me in front of 17 members of our extended family, and I'm quoting exactly, 'Let's be honest, Emma's career is really just glorified sketching. She can't even afford a real apartment. She's still living like a college student at 32, and I don't want my children thinking that's an acceptable way to live. She's accomplished nothing, and I won't apologize for having standards about who influences Sophie and Jack." The silence that followed was absolute, and I'd watched the color drain from Victoria's face as she heard her own words reflected back at her, heard how cruel they sounded when stripped of the moment's heat and reduced to simple fact, and I'd seen Mom's hand go to her mouth and Dad close his eyes briefly, as if in pain. Derek had been watching Victoria with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between disappointment and recognition, and Victoria had sunk back onto the couch, her defensive armor cracking visibly, and she'd whispered, "I didn't mean it like that." But we all knew that she'd meant exactly what she'd said, that those words had reflected what she truly believed about me. "I was good enough to need now," I'd said quietly, setting the timeline back in my folder. but I was never good enough before, and that's what needs to be acknowledged before we can move forward with anything." Victoria had sat in silence for maybe 10 seconds after I'd said that, her face still pale, her hands gripping the edge of the couch cushion. And then she'd done exactly what I'd anticipated she would do. She'd attacked the one thing she'd always believed made her superior to me, and she'd said with forced strength, returning to her voice, "This is all very dramatic, Emma, but let's not pretend you're in some position of power here. You're trying to make yourself into the victim when the reality is that you've spent years struggling to make anything of yourself. Your architecture career has been one failed project after another. You're 32 years old living in a studio apartment, and now you want to act like I'm the problem when really you're just bitter that I've built something substantial with my life." I'd watched her deliver this speech, watched her trying to rebuild her defenses by tearing me down, by reasserting the narrative that had sustained her sense of superiority for years. And I'd seen Mom shift uncomfortably and Dad open his mouth as if to say something, but then close it again. And I'd known this was the moment. This was when I either let her reestablish the old dynamic or I showed them all what I'd been keeping to myself for the past 9 months. "Actually," I'd said quietly, reaching for my bag and pulling out my tablet, "about that architecture career you mentioned." And I'd unlocked the screen and opened the folder I'd labeled simply Portland Project, and I'd turned the tablet so they could all see the rendered images of the cultural center, the sweeping glass facade and the public plaza and the interior atrium with its geometric skylight. And I'd said, "This is the Northwest Cultural Center in Portland, a $2.1 million project that broke ground in March, and I'm the lead designer." The room had gone still again, but this was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of recalibration, of people trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they'd believed. And I'd watched Victoria lean forward to look at the screen, watched her eyes scan the professional renderings, and I'd continued. "I won the design competition last February, 9 months ago, beating out 43 other firms, including two that you've probably heard of, and the project has been featured in Architectural Digest, Architecture Northwest, and Design Quarterly." I'd swiped to the next image, the Architectural Digest article with my photo and the headline, "Emerging Designers Reshaping the Pacific Northwest." And I'd seen Dad's eyes widen and Mom's hand go to her chest, and Victoria had looked from the screen to my face and back to the screen like she was trying to find the trick, the explanation for how this could possibly be real. "The contract was worth $185,000 in design fees," I'd continued, keeping my voice level and professional, "plus additional compensation for project management, and I've since been shortlisted for 2 other major projects and won a regional AIA honor award for the Cultural Center design." I'd swiped through more images, showing the award certificate, showing the construction progress photos, showing an email from the Portland Arts Commission praising the design, and Derek had been leaning forward now, too, actually studying the images with what looked like genuine interest or maybe professional appreciation. "I haven't been struggling," I'd said, looking directly at Victoria. "I've been building a career, and I've been succeeding, and I made a deliberate choice not to share any of this with any of you because I was tired of performing for approval that never came, tired of trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I had none." Victoria's face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession, shock and disbelief, and something that might have been recognition that her entire understanding of our relative positions had just been fundamentally undermined, and Mom had said, "Emma, sweetheart, why didn't you tell us? We had no idea. This is wonderful." But her voice had carried confusion and maybe hurt that I'd kept this from them. I'd looked at Mom then, and I'd said gently but firmly, "I didn't tell you, because every time I'd shared good news before, it was either dismissed or minimized or turned into a conversation about Victoria's achievements. And I learned it was easier to just keep my successes to myself than to watch them be diminished." Dad had been the first to speak after I'd explained why I'd kept my success hidden, and he'd said quietly, "Emma, we never meant to make you feel that way. But even as he'd said it, I'd seen the recognition in his eyes that they had done exactly that. That years of redirecting conversations and celebrating Victoria's accomplishments while treating mine as footnotes had created the very dynamic he was now denying. I'd taken a breath and continued, because this wasn't the moment for comforting them. This was the moment for truth, and I'd said, I signed the Cultural Center contract in February for $185,000 in design fees, and I've earned an additional $67,000 from consultation work on related projects. And I'm currently negotiating contracts for two other major commissions that together would be worth another $240,000. So when Victoria characterizes me as struggling and unstable and living like a college student, she's describing a version of me that maybe existed 4 years ago, but hasn't been accurate for quite some time. I'd swiped to my banking app then, knowing this was crass, but also knowing it was necessary, and I'd shown them the account balance, $178,430.19, as of that morning, and I'd said, I bought out my studio lease 3 months ago, and I've been looking at houses, actual houses with yards, because I can afford that now. I just hadn't mentioned it because I'd learned that my life wasn't something this family was particularly interested in, unless it was being used as a cautionary tale. Victoria had been staring at the tablet screen like it contained information in a language she couldn't quite parse, and I'd watched the calculations happening behind her eyes. The realization that not only was I not the failure she'd positioned me as, but I was actually in better financial shape than she'd probably suspected. And Derek had made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something sadder, and he'd said, Jesus, Victoria, she's got more liquid assets than we do right now. The statement had hung in the air for a moment, this admission that broke through whatever remaining pretense Victoria had been trying to maintain, and Victoria had turned to look at Derek with an expression of betrayal, but Derek had just shaken his head slightly and turned to me, and he'd said with what sounded like genuine respect, Emma, I owe you an apology. I went along with Victoria's assessment of your situation without ever questioning it, without ever actually talking to you or asking about your work, and that was wrong. I'd nodded in acknowledgement, appreciating that Derek at least could admit his part in this, and then I'd looked at my parents and I'd said, I learned I didn't need your approval. I learned that I could build something meaningful and valuable without performing it for an audience that had already decided I wasn't worth their attention. And that was actually freeing in a way I hadn't expected. Mom had tears in her eyes now, and she'd said, We're proud of you, sweetheart. We always have been. But I'd shaken my head gently and I'd said, Mom, with respect, if you'd been proud, you would have noticed. You would have asked questions. You would have wondered why I stopped sharing things about my work. But you didn't, because it was easier to accept Victoria's narrative than to challenge it. The words had been hard to say, but necessary. And I'd seen them land, seen my parents finally confronting their own complicity in the dynamic that had pushed me to the margins of this family. And Victoria had stood up suddenly, her face flushed with what I recognized as humiliation, because she was experiencing now what I'd experienced 6 months ago at Mom's birthday dinner, this public accounting of failures and misjudgments. So what is this, Emma? Victoria had said, her voice sharp with defensive anger. You kept all this secret just so you could have this moment, so you could humiliate me in front of everyone the way you claim I humiliated you? I'd remained seated, kept my voice level, and I'd said, No, Victoria, I kept it private because I was protecting myself, because I'd learned that sharing my life with this family meant having it diminished or dismissed or used against me. But you're right that there's symmetry here. You're experiencing what it feels like to have your fundamental understanding of yourself challenged in front of people you care about. And maybe that will help you understand why your words 6 months ago mattered so much. I'd closed the cover on my tablet then, and I'd set it aside, and I'd said, So let's return to the actual situation we're here to discuss. You need my signature to sell the property, and I'm willing to provide it under 3 conditions. Fair market value for my half, which is $127,000, based on the assessment I had done last week. A genuine apology that acknowledges the specific harm you've caused over the past 5 years, and regular access to Sophie and Jack without conditions or supervision, or your commentary on my life choices. Victoria had sunk back onto the couch, and I'd watched her trying to process everything, trying to reconcile her need for what I could provide, with her resistance to admitting she'd been wrong. And the room had fallen into a tense silence as everyone waited to see what she would do. Victoria sat there on the couch for what felt like a full minute, her breathing uneven, her hands now clasped together in her lap. And I watched her struggling with something fundamental, something that went beyond just the immediate need for my signature. And I recognized it because I'd experienced my own version of this same struggle 6 months ago when I'd driven home from Mom's birthday dinner and had to decide whether to keep trying to earn acceptance from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth it. She looked at Derek first, and I saw something pass between them. Some wordless communication that seemed to carry years of their relationship in it. And Derek reached over and took her hand, and he said quietly, "She's right, Vic. She's right about all of it." And Victoria's face crumpled slightly at that, at hearing her husband side with me after I'd just dismantled the narrative she'd built about our relative worth. Mom had moved closer and put a hand on Victoria's shoulder, and I'd expected Mom to offer some platitude or some way for Victoria to save face. But instead, Mom said, "Honey, you need to apologize. You need to really apologize for how you've treated your sister." And there was a firmness in her voice that I hadn't heard her use with Victoria before. And I'd realized that maybe the confrontation I'd forced was shifting more than just my relationship with Victoria. It was shifting the entire family dynamic. Victoria had looked up at Mom, and then at Dad, who'd been standing near the fireplace, and Dad had nodded and said, "Emma's conditions are more than fair, and they're honestly less than you deserve to face after what you've put her through." And I'd seen Victoria flinch at that, at having our father state so plainly that she was the one in the wrong. Victoria had turned back to me then, and her eyes were filling with tears that looked different from the shocked tears earlier. These looked like tears that came from somewhere deeper, and she'd said, "I don't know how to do this, Emma. I don't know how to admit that I've been—" But her voice had broken, and she'd stopped. I'd waited, not helping her, not offering her an easy path through this, because I'd learned that real change only came from genuinely facing uncomfortable truths, and she needed to find her own words for this. "I've been cruel to you," Victoria finally said, and her voice was thick with tears now, actual tears running down her face. "I've been systematically cruel to you for years, and I told myself it was about protecting my kids, or about tough love, or about you needing to get your life together. But it wasn't about any of that. It was about me feeling threatened." I'd felt something shift in my chest at those words, at hearing Victoria name the real motivation, and she'd continued, "You were always so talented, even when we were kids. You could draw anything and make it beautiful, and Mom and Dad would show your sketches to their friends. And I couldn't do that. I couldn't create anything. I could just work hard and follow rules and achieve in conventional ways. And I told myself that meant I was better, more responsible, more successful. But I always knew deep down that you had something I didn't have." Victoria had wiped at her face with shaking hands, and Derek had handed her a tissue from the box on the side table, and she'd said, "When you chose architecture over law, when you chose the uncertain path instead of the safe one, I was so angry because it felt like you were showing off, like you were saying you didn't need the safety net I needed. And when you struggled financially those first few years, I felt vindicated. I felt like I'd been right, like your talent didn't matter because I had stability and money and a conventional success. And I used that. I used my access to my kids as a way to maintain that feeling of superiority." I'd sat there listening to this confession, watching my sister finally being honest about motivations she'd probably never fully admitted even to herself, and I'd felt my anger not disappearing but transforming into something more complex, something that included understanding alongside the hurt. "I'm sorry, Emma," Victoria said, looking directly at me now, her face blotchy and her eyes red. I'm genuinely sorry for keeping you from Sophie and Jack, for all the birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments you should have had with them. I'm sorry for humiliating you at Mom's party, for every dismissive comment, for every time I made you feel small so I could feel big. I'm sorry for being so threatened by your talent and your courage that I tried to diminish you, and I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to finally see what I was doing. I'd sat there for a moment after Victoria's apology, letting the words settle, feeling the weight of years of hurt meeting this moment of genuine accountability, and I'd realized that while the apology didn't erase the damage, it did create the possibility of something different moving forward. And I'd said, I accept your apology, Victoria, and I'm willing to sign the papers for the sale at fair market value, $127,000 for my half. And we can structure it as a payment plan if you need to, since I know you're waiting on the sale to complete to have the full amount. Derek had looked at me with visible relief, and he'd said, we can do $50,000 at closing and the remaining $77,000 in monthly installments of $6,500 over 12 months. I can have our attorney draw up a promissory note. And I'd nodded and said that worked for me. And then I'd looked at Victoria and I'd said, but I need you to understand that moving forward, my relationship with this family, with you, needs to be built on actual respect, not on the assumption that your life choices are superior to mine, not on you having veto power over whether I'm good enough to be around your children. Victoria had nodded, wiping at her face, and she'd said, I understand. And I want you in their lives, Emma. I want them to know their aunt, the real you, not the version I created to make myself feel better. And I'd felt something cautiously hopeful begin to grow in my chest. We'd spent another hour that evening working out details. Derek had called their attorney, who'd agreed to draft the sale documents and the promissory note. And before I'd left, I'd said, I'd like to see Sophie and Jack this weekend, maybe Saturday afternoon. I could take them to the Science Museum if that's okay. And Victoria had said yes immediately, had even offered to have them ready by noon. The following Saturday had arrived, and I'd been nervous in a way I hadn't expected, worried that the kids wouldn't remember me or would be confused about why I'd been absent. But when I'd picked them up, Sophie had hugged me immediately, and Jack had asked if I was really an architect, and could I show them my drawings. And we'd spent 4 hours at the museum and then getting ice cream, and they'd both been so excited to talk to me, so hungry for connection with someone who wasn't their parents or teachers, and I'd realized that Victoria had deprived them of something too, not just me. Mom and Dad had asked to meet with me privately the Tuesday after that first visit with the kids, and we'd sat in their kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast throughout my childhood, and Dad had said, Emma, we owe you an apology too. We enabled Victoria's treatment of you, we accepted her narrative without question, and we didn't stand up for you when we should have. And Mom had added, we were so focused on the external markers of success, on Victoria's conventional achievements, that we failed to see what you were building. And we're sorry. I'd accepted their apology too, though I'd also been honest that rebuilding trust would take time, that their silence during years of Victoria's exclusion had hurt almost as much as Victoria's active cruelty, and they'd nodded and said they understood. The property sale had closed 5 weeks later. Victoria and Derek had moved into a modest 3-bedroom house in a less expensive neighborhood. Their mansion sold to cover debts, and I'd received my first payment of $50,000, which I'd deposited into my savings account. And the monthly payments had started arriving on the first of each month, exactly as agreed. 7 weeks after that confrontation in my parents' living room, we'd had a family dinner that felt different from every family dinner I could remember. Victoria had cooked instead of catering. We'd eaten at her new, smaller dining table, and Sophie and Jack had spent most of the meal talking to me about the architectural sketches I'd brought to show them, pointing out buildings they'd seen and asking how they were designed. Victoria had watched me with her kids, and I'd seen something in her expression that might have been regret, or might have been acceptance, or might have been both. And when the kids had been clearing dishes, she'd said quietly, "Thank you for giving me a chance to fix this. I know I didn't deserve it." And I'd said, "We're family." Victoria, and that means something to me even when it's been hard. But we're building something new now, something honest. I'd driven home that evening thinking about worth and validation and the long journey I'd taken from seeking approval to finding it within myself. And I'd realized that the vindication I'd experienced hadn't actually come from Victoria's apology or from revealing my success to my family. It had come from the moment months earlier when I'd decided my worth wasn't contingent on their recognition, and everything else had just been claiming space for that truth. The relationship with my family wasn't perfect now, and probably never would be. Victoria still sometimes slipped into old patterns of condescension before catching herself. My parents still occasionally revealed their lingering belief that conventional success mattered more than creative achievement. But there was honesty now where there had been pretense, there was acknowledgement where there had been dismissal, and I had regular Sunday afternoons with Sophie and Jack, where I could be the aunt I'd always wanted to be. I'd signed the final payment receipt 3 months ago, the $127,000 fully paid, and Victoria had written, "Thank you for everything," in the memo line of that last check, and I'd deposited it and felt something close to peace. Not because the money validated me, but because the entire experience had proven that I could stand up for myself, could demand respect, could maintain boundaries while still leaving room for relationship, and those were achievements that no architectural prize could match.